I never thought I'd be the person writing one of these posts. Hell, I used to scroll through Reddit at 2 a.m., reading other people's insane stories and thinking that would never happen to me. But here I am, 5 years later, still trying to process what I discovered in the summer of 2019. I'm telling this story now because I finally feel ready, and because I need people to understand that sometimes the people we think we know best are complete strangers. My grandfather, Robert Mitchell, died in March of 2019 at the age of 87. He'd lived a quiet life in rural Pennsylvania, about 40 minutes outside of Pittsburgh, in a small town called Millvale that most people have never heard of. Growing up, I spent every summer at his house, a modest 2-story farmhouse on 15 acres of land that backed up against thick woods. Grandpa Rob was everything you'd expect from a Korean War veteran, stern but fair, quiet, hard-working, and incredibly private. He taught me how to fish, how to change a car's oil, and how to play chess. My grandmother passed away when I was 12, and after that, Grandpa became even more withdrawn, but our bond never weakened. When he died, it wasn't unexpected. He'd been declining for about a year, and honestly, I think he was ready to go. The funeral was small, just me, my parents, my sister, a handful of his old friends from the VFW, and some neighbors. What surprised me was that in his will, he left the entire property to me. Not to my father, his son, but to me, his 28-year-old grandson who was working a dead-end job in marketing and living in a cramped apartment in Philadelphia. My dad seemed hurt but tried not to show it. "He always had a special connection with you," he said, forcing a smile at the lawyer's office. "He'd want you to have it." The property was paid off, and there was even a small amount of money left over after estate taxes, enough that I could quit my job and spend a few months fixing up the house to either sell it or rent it out. I chose the latter. I'd always loved that place, and the idea of selling it felt like betraying Grandpa's memory. I moved into the house in late April of 2019. Spring in Pennsylvania is beautiful, everything coming back to life after a brutal winter. The house needed work, but it had good bones. I spent the first few weeks cleaning, painting, fixing loose floorboards, and replacing some ancient plumbing fixtures. The property itself was mostly wooded, with a large clearing where the house sat and an old barn that Grandpa had used for storage. It was while cleaning out that barn in mid-June that I found the first clue. I was sorting through decades of accumulated junk, rusted tools, old furniture, boxes of yellowed newspapers, and mysterious machine parts that I couldn't identify. In the back corner, hidden behind a rotting workbench, I found a metal toolbox that was locked with a padlock. The box itself wasn't unusual. Grandpa had dozens of similar containers scattered around the property. What caught my attention was that this lock looked new. Shiny. Recently oiled. I'm not proud of this, but I broke the lock with bolt cutters. Inside the toolbox, I found something that made my blood run cold, a detailed hand-drawn map of the property, but it showed something that didn't exist, or at least, something I'd never seen. In the woods, about a quarter mile from the house, there was a marking labeled entrance with coordinates written beneath it. 40.4937 degrees north, 79.9245 degrees west. My first thought was that maybe Grandpa had buried something out there. Some veterans hid money or valuables, artifacts from the war, things they didn't want anyone to find. But the map was too detailed, too carefully preserved. This wasn't just about a buried coffee can full of cash. There were notations about ventilation systems, power supplies, and something labeled archive room. This was something bigger. I decided to investigate that same afternoon. The coordinates led me deep into the woods, to an area I'd rarely explored as a kid. The underbrush was thick, and I had to use a machete to clear some of the path. After about 20 minutes of hiking, I found it, or almost didn't find it, because it was so well hidden. Beneath a massive fallen oak tree, concealed by decades of leaf litter and moss, there was a hatch. It was made of heavy steel, painted to blend in with the surrounding earth and covered with a camouflage tarp that had practically become part of the forest floor. If I hadn't been specifically looking for it, I would have walked right past it. My heart was pounding as I cleared away the debris. The hatch had a recessed handle and a keyhole. I didn't have a key. I went back to the house and tore through every drawer, every box, every jacket pocket. It took me 3 hours, but I finally found it, a small brass key on a chain, hidden inside an old tobacco tin in Grandpa's bedroom closet, tucked behind a stack of folded sweaters that smelled like mothballs and Old Spice. My hands were shaking as I held it. The next morning, I returned to the hatch. I'd barely slept, my mind racing with possibilities. What was down there? Why had Grandpa kept the secret? Was I about to find something illegal? Something dangerous? Part of me wondered if I should call the police, but what would I even say? I found a hatch in the woods and I'm scared to open it. They'd probably laugh me off the phone. The key fit perfectly. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet forest. I lifted the hatch. It was heavy, requiring all my strength, and stared down into darkness. A ladder descended about 15 feet into what appeared to be a concrete tunnel. There was a light switch mounted on the wall just below the hatch. I flipped it, and fluorescent lights flickered to life below. I'm not going to lie, I almost chickened out right there. Everything in my gut told me to close that hatch, forget I'd ever found it, and just sell the property. But curiosity is a powerful thing, and I'd already come this far. I climbed down. The bunker was much larger than I'd imagined. The entrance tunnel led to a main room about 20 by 30 feet, with a ceiling height of maybe 8 feet. The walls were lined with industrial shelving units, and the air smelled stale but not unpleasant. There was a ventilation system humming somewhere. The bunker was divided into several areas, a living space with a cot and some basic furniture, a kitchenette with canned goods and bottled water, a bathroom with a chemical toilet, and most disturbingly, what appeared to be a small office area with filing cabinets and a desk. Everything was organized with military precision. The canned goods were arranged by type and date: beans, soups, vegetables, all lined up like soldiers. The filing cabinets were labeled with years: 1968 to 1975, 1976 to 1983, 1984 to 1991, 1992 to 1999, 2000 to 2007, 2008 to 2015. The most recent files ended in 2015. About 4 years before Grandpa's death. On the desk sat an old laptop, not ancient, maybe from 2010 or so, and next to it was a stack of notebooks filled with Grandpa's distinctive handwriting. The walls were covered with maps, photographs, and what looked like evidence boards you'd see in police procedurals, with red string connecting various points. I opened the first filing cabinet, the one labeled 1968 to 1975. What I found inside would occupy the next 6 months of my life and fundamentally change how I understood my grandfather, my family, and the world we live in. The files contained documentation of everything, and I mean everything. Newspaper clippings, photographs, handwritten notes, official documents, and investigative reports, all meticulously organized. But these weren't Grandpa's war records or family documents. These were investigations. Cold cases. Unsolved crimes. My grandfather had been a private investigator. But not just any pie. As I read through the files, a picture emerged of a man who had dedicated decades of his life to solving cases that law enforcement had given up on. Missing persons. Unsolved murders. Financial crimes. The files went back to 1968, just a few years after he'd returned from Korea and settled in Pennsylvania. The first case file I read in detail was from 1972. A young woman named Susan Pendleton had disappeared from a neighboring county. She was 23, a schoolteacher, last seen leaving a grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon in September. The police had investigated for 6 months before the case went cold. Grandpa's file was 3 inches thick. He'd interviewed dozens of people. I could see his notes from conversations, his observations about their body language, inconsistencies he'd noticed. He traced her movements, identified that she'd been having problems with an ex-boyfriend, and eventually connected the dots to the ex-boyfriend's father, a local businessman named Richard Vance with political connections. Grandpa's notes indicated he'd turned over his findings to the state police in 1974. I looked up the case online later that night. Susan Pendleton's remains were found in a shallow grave in 1975, and Richard Vance was convicted of her murder in 1976. The case was considered solved thanks to an anonymous tip. That tip had been my grandfather. I spent the entire day in that bunker, reading file after file. Each one told a similar story. Grandpa would learn about an unsolved case usually from newspaper articles or word of mouth, conduct his own investigation using methods that were meticulous and professional, and then anonymously submit his findings to the appropriate authorities. In some cases, his information led to arrests and convictions. In others, the cases remained unsolved, but Grandpa had at least tried. There was the case of Michael Torres, a teenager who went missing in 1979. Grandpa's investigation suggested the boy had been murdered by a family member over a dispute about money. His file showed months of surveillance, interviews with neighbors, and financial records that pointed to the uncle. The uncle was eventually arrested in 1981. There was the case of the Harrisburg bank robbery in 1985, where 3 armed men stole over $200,000 and were never caught. Grandpa's file showed he'd tracked down 2 of the 3 robbers through a series of connections involving known associates and money transfers. His anonymous tip led to their arrest in 1987. There was the case of Emily Chen, an 8-year-old girl who disappeared from a playground in 1990. This file was heartbreaking to read. Grandpa had worked on it for 3 years, following every lead, interviewing hundreds of people, creating detailed timelines. He eventually identified a registered sex offender who had been living in the area under a false name. The man was arrested, and Emily's remains were recovered in 1993. She'd been dead within hours of her abduction. Case after case. Year after year. My grandfather had been doing this work in secret for decades, never taking credit, never seeking recognition. Just quietly pursuing justice for people who deserved answers. But here's where it gets complicated, and why I'm still processing all of this years later. In the more recent files, particularly from the 1990s onward, Grandpa's investigations took on a different tone. He wasn't just solving random cold cases anymore. He was investigating something bigger. Something connected. There were files on missing children throughout Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia spanning 30 years. Grandpa had identified patterns that law enforcement had apparently missed or ignored. Certain types of children, runaways, foster kids, children from troubled homes. Kids that society had already failed, kids whose disappearances didn't make headlines. They disappeared from different jurisdictions, making it hard to see the pattern, but Grandpa had connected them. He'd created maps showing clusters of disappearances, timelines showing patterns in when they occurred, and lists of persons of interest who appeared in multiple cases. The most disturbing file was labeled simply the network. This file suggested that Grandpa believed there was an organized group operating throughout the region, involved in child trafficking. He'd identified several men, some of them prominent citizens, business owners, even local politicians who appeared connected to multiple cases. The documentation was extensive but incomplete. There were photographs of these men at public events, charity dinners, political fundraisers, business conferences. There were copies of their business records, notes about their travel patterns, property ownership records, and witness statements from people Grandpa had interviewed who mentioned seeing these men in suspicious circumstances. One man, a real estate developer named Thomas Carver, appeared in at least 9 different case files. Grandpa had documented that Carver owned multiple properties throughout the region: warehouses, vacant buildings, a defunct summer camp, places that would be perfect for hiding illegal activities. Another man, a doctor named Lawrence Pennington, had been investigated but never charged with inappropriate conduct with young patients. A third man, a lawyer named Douglas Finn, had represented several convicted sex offenders and seemed to have connections to individuals in multiple states. But there was no resolution. No indication that Grandpa had ever reported this to authorities or that anyone had been arrested in connection with the network. The investigation appeared to have simply stopped. The final entry in this file was dated November 2015, just 4 years before Grandpa's death. It was a handwritten note in his distinctive script that simply said, "Too big. Too connected. They know I'm investigating. Found surveillance equipment in my truck. Someone has been in the house. Stopping for safety of family. God forgive me for leaving this unfinished." I sat in that bunker for hours, trying to process what I'd discovered. My grandfather, the quiet, reserved man who taught me to fish and play chess, had been conducting vigilante investigations for almost 50 years. He'd solved cases that stumped police. He'd identified a potential trafficking network. And then he'd stopped, apparently because he believed his life was in danger, or worse, that his family might be targeted. I thought back to the last few years of his life. He'd been more paranoid than usual, I remembered. He'd installed new locks on all the doors, gotten a security camera system that seemed excessive for a rural property, and he'd become even more withdrawn from the community. At the time, I'd chalked it up to old age and maybe early dementia. Now I realized he'd been scared. I took photographs of everything with my phone, hundreds of photos of documents, notes, maps. I uploaded them to a secure cloud account with multiple backups. Then I sat with the weight of what to do next. That night, back in the house, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those files, those missing children, those names and faces staring out from decades-old photographs. If Grandpa was right and his track record suggested he usually was, then there were dangerous people still out there. People who had gotten away with horrible crimes for decades. But I'm not a detective. I'm not a cop. I'm just a guy who inherited a house and stumbled onto his grandfather's secret life. Over the next several days, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd found. I started by verifying what I could. I spent hours online, using newspaper archives and public records databases to confirm the cases in Grandpa's files. Almost everything checked out. The cases were real. The people were real. The disappearances had happened exactly as documented. And in several instances where Grandpa had identified suspects, those suspects had indeed been arrested and convicted, though usually years after Grandpa had completed his investigation, and always attributed to anonymous tips or new evidence. I also tried to find information about the network. This was harder. Most of the men Grandpa had identified were dead now. Thomas Carver had died in 2017 from a heart attack. Lawrence Pennington had committed suicide in 2012. Douglas Finn had died in a car accident in 2009. Convenient, I thought darkly. But a few were still alive. I found obituaries, news articles, business records. On the surface, these were ordinary men, successful, respected members of their communities. Thomas Carver had been a philanthropist who donated to children's charities, which felt sickeningly ironic. Lawrence Pennington had been a respected pediatrician for 30 years. Douglas Finn had served on the board of several civic organizations. But there were hints of scandal if you knew where to look. Carver's real estate company had been investigated by the state in 2003 for financial irregularities, though no charges were filed. One of the properties seized in that investigation was a warehouse in West Virginia where, according to a brief mention in a local newspaper, FBI agents had conducted a raid. No details were ever released about what they found. Pennington had lost his medical license in 2008, though the details were sealed. The public statement cited violations of professional ethics. Which could mean anything. Finn had quietly resigned from a prestigious law firm in 1998 following an internal investigation. Again, no details were made public. Nothing concrete. Nothing prosecutable, at least not anymore. But enough to make me wonder if Grandpa had been right. I knew I needed help, so I did something that might have been stupid. I contacted an investigative journalist named Rebecca Chen who worked for the Pittsburgh Tribune and had a reputation for covering cold cases and corruption. I'd seen her byline on several major stories over the years. I sent her an encrypted email through Proton Mail with a brief overview of what I'd found, along with a few sample photos of Grandpa's files, nothing too sensitive, just enough to prove this was real. She responded within 12 hours, asking to meet in person. We met at a coffee shop in Pittsburgh 3 days later, in late July. Rebecca was in her early 40s, intense and focused, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and the kind of energy that suggested she survived on caffeine and determination. I brought my laptop with more of the files digitized, and we sat in a corner booth where she could review them without anyone else seeing. I watched her eyes widen as she scrolled through the documents. She didn't say anything for almost 10 minutes, just reading, occasionally making notes in a leather journal she carried. Your grandfather was either brilliant or crazy, she said finally, looking up at me. Maybe both. He solved cases, I said. Real cases. People went to prison because of his work. Anonymously, she pointed out. Why didn't he ever come forward? Why hide all this? I think he wanted to avoid attention, I said. He was a private person. And maybe he was worried about retaliation. That last note in the file suggests he thought people were onto him. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, still studying the documents. If even half of this is legitimate, it's one of the biggest stories I've ever seen. Your grandfather connected dots that law enforcement either missed or chose not to pursue. But we need to be careful. If he was right about these people being connected and dangerous, then we could be putting ourselves at risk just by investigating. So what do we do? I asked. She looked at me seriously, her brown eyes intense. We verify everything. We follow up on the cases that still have living victims or family members. We try to find out what happened with that FBI raid in 2003. We see if any law enforcement will talk to us off the record. And we don't publish anything until we're absolutely certain we can prove it and do it safely. That conversation was the beginning of a partnership that has lasted 5 years now. Rebecca and I have worked carefully and quietly, following up on Grandpa's investigations. It's been slow, painstaking work. We've confirmed that at least 18 cases were solved, directly or indirectly, because of information Grandpa provided to authorities. We tracked down and interviewed detectives who worked these cases, and while none of them would admit to knowing my grandfather's identity at the time, a few acknowledged that the anonymous tips they received were extraordinarily detailed and accurate. We've interviewed family members of victims who had no idea that a private citizen had been investigating their loved ones' cases for years. These conversations were some of the hardest I've ever had. How do you tell a mother that a stranger spent years trying to find her missing daughter? How do you explain that your grandfather never told anyone because he valued his privacy more than recognition? But almost universally, these families were grateful. One woman, whose sister disappeared in 1988 and whose killer was caught in 1991 thanks to Grandpa's investigation, actually cried when I told her. "All these years, I thought we just got lucky," she said. "I never knew someone cared enough to spend years looking for the truth." We've obtained police records through Freedom of Information requests, though many files are still sealed or heavily redacted. We've traced property records, business transactions, and travel patterns of the men Grandpa identified. As for the network, that's been the hardest part. Proving a conspiracy requires not just showing that crimes occurred, but that they were coordinated. That's an incredibly high bar. We did make one significant discovery. Through a contact Rebecca had in the FBI, a retired agent who agreed to talk off the record, we learned that there was indeed a multi-state task force in the early 2000s investigating child trafficking networks in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. The investigation was codenamed Operation Lost Angel. It ran from 2001 to 2005 and involved multiple federal agencies. The retired agent, a man named David Martinez, met with us at a diner in Ohio in early 2020, just before the pandemic hit. He was in his 60s, with gray hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. "We were following similar patterns to what your grandfather documented," Martinez told us. "Clusters of missing kids, all vulnerable populations. We identified several persons of interest, conducted surveillance, even got warrants for a few properties." "What happened?" Rebecca asked. Martinez's jaw tightened. "Politics. Money. Pressure from above. Some of the people we were looking at had connections, campaign donors, friends of elected officials. We executed a raid on a property in West Virginia in 2003. Warehouse owned by a shell company that traced back to Thomas Carver. We found evidence of recent occupancy: mattresses, chains, children's clothing. But no victims, no hard evidence of trafficking. The case fell apart." "Was it shut down?" I asked. "Not officially," Martinez said. "But resources were redirected. Personnel were reassigned. The task force was dissolved in 2005. We were told to focus on more viable investigations. I retired 2 years later. Couldn't stomach it anymore." "Do you think my grandfather was right about an organized network?" Martinez looked at me for a long moment. "I think there were bad people doing bad things, and they were smart enough and connected enough to avoid getting caught. Whether it was a formal organization or just a loose network of like-minded criminals." He shrugged. "I couldn't prove it then. But your grandfather's documentation is more thorough than anything we compiled. If I were still on the job, I'd want to see all of it." That conversation stayed with me. The idea that Grandpa had been right, that there had been a chance to stop these people, but that the investigation was killed by politics and corruption, it made me angry in a way I'd never experienced before. Rebecca has been working on a comprehensive article series for the past year. Her editor at the Tribune has given her the green light. With a team of lawyers reviewing everything for libel issues and source protection. The plan is to publish a multi-part investigation into Grandpa's work, the cases he solved, and the questions that remain about the network. But we've hit obstacles. Some former law enforcement won't talk to us, even off the record. Some files remain sealed. And we're both aware that if Grandpa was scared enough to stop investigating, we might be putting ourselves at risk by continuing. I've taken precautions. The bunker contents are backed up in multiple secure locations. I've written a detailed will leaving everything to Rebecca if anything happens to me, with instructions to publish it all. I've also shared selected information with a lawyer and told several trusted friends that if I die unexpectedly, they should contact the FBI. Living in Grandpa's house has been strange. I've renovated most of it, new kitchen, updated bathrooms, fresh paint throughout. It's comfortable now, even cozy. I work from home doing freelance marketing consulting, which gives me the flexibility to continue this investigation. But I'm always aware of the weight of what's hidden in those woods. Sometimes late at night, I'll walk out to the bunker with a flashlight, climb down into that concrete room, and sit at Grandpa's desk. I'll read through his notes, studying his handwriting, trying to understand the man who spent 50 years of his life pursuing justice in secret. I've found some of his personal journals too, mixed in with the case files. They give me insight into his thinking, his motivations, his fears. In one entry from 1985, he wrote, "Solved the Harris murder case today. Anonymous call to the state police with the location of the weapon. They'll arrest the brother-in-law within a week. Nancy Harris will have closure. But I can never tell her it was me. Can never accept thanks. This is the price of the work. Recognition would bring attention, and attention would end the work. Better to be unknown and effective than famous and useless." In another entry from 1997, Emily Chen's mother stopped by the grocery store today. She looked tired, aged beyond her years. It's been 4 years since her daughter's remains were found, since the monster who killed her went to prison. She doesn't know I'm the one who found him. Sometimes I want to tell her, to let her know that someone cared enough to never give up. But that would be selfish. This work isn't about me. And then the entries from 2015, in the months before he stopped, someone was in the barn today. Tools moved, things disturbed. Found a tracking device under my truck. They know. I've been too visible, asked too many questions. Need to be more careful. But how can I stop? There are still children missing. Still monsters walking free. And finally, Carver saw me today at the hardware store. We made eye contact. He smiled. He knows I know. But what can I do? I'm an old man with no authority, no power. If I push harder, they'll come for me, or worse, for my family. For David. For his kids. I can't risk that. So I stop. God forgive me. Reading that last entry broke my heart. My grandfather had been carrying this burden alone for so long, and in the end, he'd been forced to walk away from unfinished work because he feared for our safety. I've learned so much about him through these files. He wasn't perfect, he broke laws, invaded privacy, sometimes used questionable methods to get information. He stalked suspects, accessed records he had no legal right to see, and manipulated people into giving him information. But he did it for the right reasons. Every case he took on was about giving voice to the voiceless, about refusing to let victims be forgotten. He solved cases that police departments had given up on. He identified predators who might have hurt more children if they hadn't been caught. He brought closure to families who deserved answers. The question that haunts me is whether I should continue his work. I don't have his skills or his training. I'm not a detective or an investigator. I'm just a guy who stumbled onto his grandfather's secret. But I have his files. I have his documentation. And I have a chance to maybe finish what he started. Rebecca thinks the articles will run in the next few months, probably by early 2025. She's optimistic that the publicity might prompt someone, maybe someone in law enforcement, maybe someone with information about the network, to come forward. I'm less optimistic. 5 years have passed since I found that bunker, and we're not much closer to answering the big questions. Were those men really part of an organized trafficking network, or were they just isolated predators? Was the FBI investigation shut down because of corruption, or just because of lack of evidence? Are there still victims out there, or did the network dissolve decades ago? I don't know. But I owe it to Grandpa to try to find out. The house still stands on those 15 acres. The woods still hide that steel hatch beneath the fallen oak. And somewhere in that bunker, in those carefully organized files, there are answers that families have been searching for, justice that's been delayed for decades, and maybe, just maybe, evidence of something bigger that still needs to be brought to light. I think about that note often. God forgive me. Was he asking forgiveness for stopping? Or for starting in the first place? For playing God with other people's cases? For taking justice into his own hands? I think he was asking forgiveness for all of it. For being human. For doing his best in an imperfect world with imperfect tools. I've come to understand that people are complicated. My grandfather wasn't a hero in the traditional sense, but he wasn't a vigilante either. He was something in between, a man who saw suffering and injustice and decided he couldn't look away. A man who spent 50 years fighting, alone and in secret, for people he'd never meet and who would never know his name. And honestly, I'm proud to be his grandson. I'm proud that when he saw something wrong, he tried to fix it. I'm proud that he valued justice more than recognition. I'm proud that he was brave enough to investigate dangerous people, even when it cost him his peace of mind. I'm also sad that he had to carry this burden alone. That he couldn't share it with family, couldn't ask for help, couldn't even take credit for the good he did. That must have been lonely beyond words. But I understand why he did it that way. Recognition would have ended the work. The moment he became known, he would have become a target. His effectiveness depended on anonymity. So I try to honor that, even as I'm working to bring his story to light. Because I think there's a difference between exposing his work, giving credit where credit is due, helping families understand that someone cared, and turning him into some kind of folk hero or vigilante symbol. He would have hated that. He would have just wanted the work to matter. And it did matter. It does matter. That's what I found in my grandfather's bunker. Not treasure or war memorabilia or buried secrets about my family's past. I found evidence of a life dedicated to something bigger than himself. Evidence of quiet heroism that went unrecognized. Evidence that one person, working alone with limited resources, can make a real difference in the world. I found proof that my grandfather was extraordinary, even though he spent his whole life trying to be ordinary. And I found a responsibility that I'm still learning how to carry. The bunker is still there. I visit it once a week, keeping everything preserved exactly as Grandpa left it. It's part museum, part shrine, part crime lab. Sometimes I bring Rebecca there when we need to cross-reference files or review evidence. Sometimes I go alone, just to sit in the quiet and feel close to him. I've added a few things of my own, my notes, my research, photographs from the conversations we've had with victims' families. In a way, I'm continuing the archive he started. Maybe someday, when this is all over, when Rebecca's articles are published and the truth is out there, I'll donate everything to a library or museum. Let scholars and researchers study it. Let it become part of the historical record. Or maybe I'll keep it secret, just like Grandpa did. Maybe some things are meant to stay hidden. I don't have all the answers. But I know this, I found my grandfather's hidden bunker in 2019, but I'm still discovering who Robert Mitchell really was. And with every file I read, every case I verify, every family I talk to, I understand him a little better. He was a man who believed that some debts can never be left unpaid. That some truths can never be left buried. That some voices deserve to be heard, even decades after they've been silenced. And he was right. So I'll keep searching. I'll keep investigating. I'll keep trying to finish what he started. Because that's what you do for family. That's what you do when someone you love leaves behind unfinished work. You pick it up, and you carry it forward. That's what I'm doing. That's what this story is about. And if anyone reading this has information about unsolved cases in Pennsylvania, Ohio, or West Virginia, especially involving missing children from the 1970s through the 2000s, I need you to come forward. Contact the Pittsburgh Tribune and ask for Rebecca Chen. Tell her what you know. Because somewhere out there, there might be answers we haven't found yet. There might be justice still waiting to be served. And my grandfather would want us to keep looking. He spent 50 years refusing to give up. The least I can do is honor that by doing the same.